So this morning, at this morning's session, Maya talked about endangered languages, and we also had a session where the French spoke in solidarity with each other. So as a consequence, beg misha kainta squelga on Tom Galer and Shaw. Is misha asera, is misha Colin Breen, time in Maconi, Kulrahin, also Kulrahin, August anov beg me kaint fui Shandaliak fui hoen. Agus Bacart doing Countess Berla Shawmock. So for the benefit of the audience, I will speak in English from here in, but who thought that the translators could speak in Gaelic as well, so congratulations to them. Just a couple of things. The last few days, This is my first time speaking at a Protecting the Past conference, and I think one of the key things that I've got from this is the very strong legacy that MENA is beginning to develop. Up until a couple of years ago, the capacity that was available in many of these regions wasn't necessarily where it should have been. And I think that strategy that MENA has developed in tandem with the universities and their in-country partners is really progressing the subject and the documentation of the subject across this region. And I think one of the things that we're now beginning to start looking at is a new generation of MENA. And very specifically, what I want to speak about is the MENA project. Much of what we've seen so far this morning and in yesterday's session has been about the terrestrial sphere, the terrestrial environment. And of course, we're conscious that archaeology, cultural resources, both tangible and intangible, aren't just focused in the terrestrial world. We also have extensive maritime resources, subsea resources within the marine environment. And MENA has been established in an attempt to extend the existing MENA strategies and methodologies out into this maritime world. This is a partnership between ourselves at Ulster University in Northern Ireland and Southampton University in England, in working partnership with the existing MENA teams at Oxford, Leicester and Durham. And we're really grateful to the Arcadia Foundation and to Maya in particular for identifying this progression, this natural progression, I think, when we begin to start looking at the cultural resource that exists across this particular region. So what MENA will do will operate in a very similar way to MENA, using very similar methodologies, but we're adapting them for the marine environment. So for the coastal zone, and we identify the maritime zone as that zone which is influenced by the sea. So we're also looking at the terrestrial zone up to about 15 to 25 kilometers inland. Any zone that is directly impacted by sea or maritime activities. And extending that out onto the seabed, onto the deep or the shallow water through to the deep water seabeds. There are different technologies and different ways of approaching this, but it's very much similar to the adaptation of the existing very successful strategies that have been identified through the existing MENA project. I should also note that while much of the last few days we focused on conflict and the damage that has been impacted upon the cultural resource through war and through violent conflict, within the maritime zone, we're looking at, while conflict has an impact, yes, of course it does, but the majority of negative impacts in terms of resource pressures are coming from this phase of hyper-development that we're moving through within this region. Hyper-development from the massive expansion of marine exploration, the development of ports, harbours, and the movement of populations towards the coast. Many of those populations pushed not only by conflict, but also through economic necessity as you move towards the coast for employment and employment opportunities. But the second major threat that's facing the coastal and marine environment is, of course, climate and environment change. We recognize that this isn't a new phenomenon. This is something that has been happening for millennia right across the coastal and marine zone, but it's something that we are much more cognizant of when it comes to understanding the major threats and issues that are impacting this particular area. In the first instance, we will focus on these 5 survey blocks across the region. Again, these are arbitrary blocks at this moment in time, but we're essentially encompassing all of the marine area of these countries. And most of these countries have an exclusive economic zone of up to 200 miles as opposed to kilometers offshore. This isn't necessarily true for every country, but that's really from about 15 kilometers inland to about 250 kilometers offshore. Now, when we begin to start talking about the maritime cultural resource, what are we speaking about? We can probably group this into 4 general themes. In the first instance, we have those cultural sites which have become submerged for whatever reason, paleo-environmental landscapes, as well as settlement which may have previously been on terrestrial land, but which is now submerged underwater. We move through to theme 2, which encompasses coastal archaeology, that coastal strip, encompassing things like ports, harbours, fishing practices, coastal industry, all of these types of site types that we associate with people living on the coast. The third theme is very much focused on our nautical past, our shared nautical past, and this focuses on cultural sites like shipwrecks, traditional boat technology, marine artifacts that were associated with ship and shipbuilding practices. And then finally, we have theme 4, our intangible cultural heritage and intangible maritime traditions within the coastal zone, including things like folklore, traditional practice, and our belief systems. And even when it comes to, much of traditional archaeological practice is about mapping sites. With the traditional delimitation and polygons associated with database construction. But within the maritime zone, we're familiar with the fact that in many communities, while there may not be a physical site offshore, it is a place associated with gin and traditional practice, and it becomes a culturally important place for the coastal communities who are living and working within that area. So from our perspective, it's just as important to delineate these traditional areas of practice as it is to document and list those physical places associated with past and contemporary marine practice. When it comes to the types of sites we might expect to find, it can be everything from the incredible harbour resources and ancient ports associated with Alexandria off the north coast of Egypt. Most of us will be familiar with this. Down to submerged town sites like Pavlo Petri in the North Mediterranean coast, and this classical period site which has been subsided and is now underwater as a consequence of tectonic activity within this area, down to ports like Aden or more traditional shipwrecks on the seabed. So a very wide diversity of site types across this area. And I guess the importance of this type of activity was exemplified by an email I got this morning from a colleague in Turkey who is part of our broader network, who has just found the oldest shipwreck in the world, dating to about 17,000 BC, or about 4,000 years ago, which has just been found off the coast of Antalya in southern Turkey. And that's the type of site and the type of excitement that can be generated through this type of work. However, one of the challenges, and one of the questions that have been asked of us on a number of occasions was, well, why can't the existing MENA team deal with many of these types of sites? And I guess much of the environment that we're dealing with requires specialist knowledge and specialist understanding. It's a very dynamic environment. It's an environment which is continually changing and subject to a whole variety of influences, both natural and anthropogenic. So when we begin to start looking at some of the environmental science which underpins these areas, we can look at the extensive amount of tectonic and seismic activity right across these areas. Each of these represents a seismic event, through to the changing sea level from the early Holocene right through to the present day. We're familiar as a consequence of contemporary climate change and environment change that sea level is changing, but sea level has always been in a constant state of flux. So when we begin to start looking out at the various proxies or variables which map out sea level change, we can see a whole variety of graphs representing different areas across the eastern Mediterranean where sea level has changed. And we can see from about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, sea level has begun to start rising at quite a rapid rate in many parts of the eastern Mediterranean. About 7,000 years ago, sea level was lower by about 10 meters in much of the eastern Med. And then over the course of the following 6,000 to 7,000 years, we see quite rapid sea level rise up to present day levels. And as a consequence of this, we're seeing the inundation and the radical change of many aspects of our coastal zone and our coastal environment. So when we go right back into the Paleolithic period, we can see that the nature of the maritime world was really quite different at that particular time. And when we begin to start moving into the Persian Gulf in particular, we'll see that this was actually dry in the lower Paleolithic period, with the resultant consequence of the potential to find early hominid remains and a whole variety of other things. We can also begin to start seeing environments which are very variable. So when we look at the bathymetry of the Red Sea, for example, in the middle of the Red Sea, sea depth, or the seabed is found at a depth of just over 2.5 kilometers, down to about 2,500 meters in depth. The Persian Gulf, or the waters of this particular part of the world, are significantly shallower. So we can see the southern shallows just off the UAE. The depths here come down to a maximum only of about 10 or 11 meters. So we're seeing very significant change and variation in terms of bottom type and variation as we move across these various areas. So very different worlds, very different maritime worlds. Just to give you a number of case examples and look to see where the genesis of this project came from, the original project started as a small-scale benchmarking project looking at post-conflict reconstruction in Syria, very specifically looking at the maritime cultural heritage resource within that coastal zone. This was a project which was funded by the Honor Frost Foundation, but the results of that project were integrated within the MENA database, very much following the principles of Arcadia's movement towards open access data. So all of the data that I will show here are now available within the MENA database, incorporated and funded by the HFF. So when we begin to start looking at the type of features that we were mapping as part of this process, many of these sites wouldn't have appeared within the existing terrestrial MENA base. So what we're looking is an extension of the existing terrestrial sites. And to date, we've added just over 330 new sites into the MENA base, which are very much maritime, are coastal sites, unique to the maritime world. The types of sites we've identified include classic tells and breakwaters, rock cut features which were used for a whole variety of things like storage, quarrying, the storage of fish, things like that, as well as submerged shipwrecks in shallow water environments. When we begin to start mapping these out, we can also take due cognizance of the way the maritime world changed. If we look in the northern part of this image, for example, in and around the Jebel area, we see this area which is now silted up. But during the Bronze Age, this would have been a marine incursion area. And then we can begin to start understanding the distribution of much of the Bronze Age material in and around this area because it's directly associated with the way the environment has changed. The environment, the coastal environment that we're looking at today is not representative of the coastal environments that would have existed across these lands over the last 10 to 12,000 years. When we begin to start looking at the issues and threats across this area, again, much of this area, we're seeing two satellite images. The image on your left is the Corona image dating to 1968, and this is the Esri satellite map dating from December 2015. And what we're seeing is really quite dramatic change across much of this landscape. Much of this process we're familiar already with MENA, and MENA has managed to map out much of this process across most of this area. We're seeing very rapid urban expansion, but much more specifically from a coastal perspective, we're seeing quite significant significant coastal change in places. So at the bottom of the image, we're seeing coastal retreat by anything up to 2 to 3 meters within the course of a 30-year period. So that process of a 3-meter change over 30 years, averaging a meter a year, is really quite dramatic and is reflective of changing agricultural practices, but also reflective of the changing nature of the environment. We look at a second area, a second case study area. Again, extensive archaeological remains associated with maritime activity, and we've identified much of the area associated with the original Bronze Age harbour, which is now silted up from about 3,000 years ago. But when we begin to start looking at the contemporary map, we see that what we're seeing now is a reverse of that previous siltation. When we look at contemporary coastal shoreline, or this is, again in red, this is the coastal shoreline from the 1970s, and what we're seeing here is the contemporary shoreline from 2015. So again, quite dramatic change within this coastal environment as the coast ebbs and flows associated with environmental change, associated with climate change, but also much more specifically in this area associated with the anthropogenic changes conducted by the agricultural or the intensification of agricultural activity within this particular area. So all of this then is beginning to start moving on. So we're documenting, we're in the process for the first time of documenting much of the maritime archaeological resource from many of these countries, which hasn't been done before. We've seen quite strong maritime archaeological activity taking place in certain areas, but the majority of the countries across this area have seen very little, if any, maritime archaeological work done. And it's beginning to start integrating that process of resource and site discovery, following through in our various field campaigns, looking at these sites in much more detail, conducting geophysical survey on an intensive basis at a number of case studies, reacting against rapid change or increased threat at major places, and then beginning to start moving towards suggesting avenues as an add-on to this project, looking at ways with which the resource can be better protected, the ways it can be better managed, and ultimately the ways which we can examine in terms of knowledge dissemination and the distribution of the types of information and data sets that we're getting out to the wider world and into the communities where these information, these data are required for the most part. So ultimately what we're looking at, and I think in many ways this image exemplifies the nature of change that has taken place within the maritime world. Most of us will be familiar with these images from Sharjah, dating to the early part of the 20th century, and the really profound and dramatic change that has occurred within this area. When we look at the traditional boat practices, the traditional ways that communities would have lived and worked in this area, in comparison to the massive industrialization, the intensification of settlement, and the intensification of activities, cultural activities, that have taken place across this region. What this new Arcadia project is doing is beginning to start redressing that imbalance, beginning to start and documenting these past changes in the hope of protecting them and documenting them for future prosperity. Thank you.